A man and his son are out one day and are involved in a terrible car accident. The father is killed on impact, but the son survives and is rushed into hospital. Now the surgeon looks at the boy and says, "I can't operate. This boy is my son." Now, I've presented this scenario to many people before, and there seems to be a common trend in thought, namely that the surgeon must be a man, but the father is dead, and so the scenario must be false. And yes, this is a valid form of explanation, but what about the mother? The assumption that the surgeon would be a man is an example of unconscious bias or implicit assumptions. It's that almost reflex reaction we have when we see a face or hear a name that produces a series of connotations and characteristics that actually have no objective basis. This is a basis that aligns a particular skill set with a particular gender, in this instance that the surgeon would be a man. And it's the result of a culturally produced ideals about the natural capabilities of men and women. These assumptions happen with relative frequency in our society, so frequently in fact that sometimes we rarely even notice them. This talk will hopefully look at their manifestations in the arts and the sciences, where I would argue that the divergence is at its most poignant. In last year's application cycle to the University of Cambridge, 60% of natural science entrants, 86% of computer science entrants, and 73% of engineering entrants were men. Why? Unconscious bias, again. But not just on a personal, subjective level, but on a structural, societal basis. It's a basis that assumes men are better at the sciences with the analytical, statistical, factual stuff, and women are better at the humanities with the emotional, discursive, subjective approach. It's an assumption that is perpetuated by the chemistry sets we give to boys and the dolls' houses we give to girls, by the comments of exceptionality we have when a young girl is studying A-level physics in a state school, for example, and the eyebrows we may raise when we hear about a man teaching primary school kids. An attempt to quantify this was made by the Women's Campaign last year in the Mind the Gap survey, which attempted to look at the gender attainment gap in subjects across the university. It surveyed 1,400 undergraduates and found worrying feelings of alienation amongst women in traditionally male-dominated fields of study, namely the sciences. These feelings were said to contribute to the gender attainment gap, which we see year on year in these subjects. Now, of course, there's a complex interplay of personal and structural factors that must be factored into account when looking at the gender attainment gap, but I think it's certainly interesting to think that the way that we gender consciousness and capability plays a part in that. One participant stated an example of a lecturer in a biology module who was showing a PowerPoint presentation of famous scientists and their discoveries. Now, the only time a female scientist was mentioned, the lecturer made a comment about how pretty she looked. So not a comment on her ability or her discoveries at all. So these cultural attitudes about aesthetics and intellect are pervasive, informing how we construct gender and what those genders are capable of. Another way of trying to sort of quantify these relationships is through an implicit association test, where researchers test to see how unconsciously biased an individual person may be. With the example of women and science, participants might be asked to associate words like woman and wife with words like astronomy and physics. Now, according to a 2009 study by the National Academy of Science, across 34 countries, 70% of people were quicker to associate male terms with science than female terms. This relationship is often said to be based on biological facts, but I would argue that instead it is sociological. I'm not saying that biological differences don't exist, they do, but what I am saying is that gender differences are more subtle and more nuanced than biology alone. So here, sex refers to the biological characteristics, and gender refers to the social identity and social characteristic that a cultural society attributes to a gender, usually along masculine or feminine lines if you're operating within a binary. Arguably, what differentiates genders most in society is not biological differences, but power, which in turn is a comment on what that society values. So from my perspective, if we're ever to understand the differences in how men and women behave in the arts and the sciences, so namely in gender attainment gaps and gaps in fields of study, we must first accept that men and women are expected to behave differently. A common narrative that you might have heard is that men are better at maths than women. Indeed, in the United States, for example, men have consistently performed around 31 to 36 points higher in the math portion of the SAT test in every year since 1994, which might lead you to suggest that men really are better at maths than women. However, Luigi Guiso's 2003 investigation found that in countries with higher levels of gender equality, the maths attainment gap actually shifted. In Iceland, which has the world's highest level of gender equality, women actually outperformed men. So this correlation is certainly interesting, though by no means watertight, but it does suggest a cultural causal impact on capability. Performance is linked to social power, and without making too radical a suggestion, power in our society is gendered. When you think of a politician, a CEO, or even a surgeon, what do you think of? Now, a 2013 investigation by Takiko Harada found that simply having a woman recall an experience where she exercised power actually improved her maths scores. Now, you might have noticed that I have thus far focused on women in science, which is a particular concern for this institution in particular. The University of Cambridge is currently taking part in the Athena Swan programme, which is a national programme looking at issues of attraction, retention and attainment in the science and technology. We currently have an institutional silver award and are working towards a gold, as well as looking to roll out the framework in the arts and humanities, where, interestingly, despite women dominating those subjects, there is an attainment gap of around 10% that exists, with women bearing the brunt of that deficit. But of course, men are equally as affected by this bias, especially in the arts, stemming from what I like to call a demonization of the feminine, or a rejection of the characteristics traditionally associated with women. Women outnumber men 6-1 in primary school teaching, and in the University of Cambridge, they dominate English, art history, veterinary medicine, amongst others, suggesting a gendering of consciousness and capabilities that is profoundly unequal. However, returning to our earlier discussion about social power, it's interesting to note that the leading figures in the arts and the humanities, Dante, Chaucer, Milton, Karl Marx, Mozart, are all men. Why is this a problem? As Women's Officer of this university, it should probably come as no surprise to you that I don't believe in gendering people into boxes, nor do I believe in biologically essentialist methods of determining people's capabilities. Studies have shown that culture influences consciousness, which in turn influences capabilities. Challenging our consciousness is the first step to connecting the arts and the sciences. Because these assumptions actually do have wide-reaching social, political, and economic impacts. McKinsey's 2015 Diversity Matters report suggested that companies in the top quartile for gender equality enjoyed higher economic returns and higher worker-employee satisfaction rates, suggesting that gender equality really is better for everyone. But this is a little bit like blue sky thinking at the moment, very much in keeping with consultancy, and we are very far away from that reality. A 2010 study by the European Union found that in science and technology, women made up 35% of PhD graduates, 32% of entry-level positions, and only 11% of full-time professors. The picture is equally bleak in the arts, in terms of power and leadership, certainly. Research suggests that not only are women more qualified in the arts, but that their numbers are increasing. Claw's leadership study of 2014 suggested that in the top 10 subsidised theatre boards in the UK, only 33% of those positions were held by women. Similarly, only 36% of artistic directors in the UK are women at the moment. This, to me, is absurd, and I hope to you too, suggesting a pattern of stereotyping and binaries in which gender and leadership are powered as well as arts and the sciences. The Renaissance period witnessed what is now regarded as a birth of genius. Polymaths, or Renaissance men, such as Da Vinci and Galileo, dominated the arts and the sciences, creating poetry alongside machines, and nothing was seen as out of the ordinary about this. I want you to challenge your unconscious bias. Hopefully after this discussion, your biases will no longer be unconscious, and I want you to be the Renaissance man, woman, non-binary individual that you want to be, and encourage that in your friends. Because this isn't just about connecting the arts and sciences, but connecting us all as people, capable of whatever we want. So I'll leave you with this statistic and ask you that whether you think, if we began to think differently, whether that number would increase. Thank you.